How you guys doing? Yes, today's video is going to be a bagger because we are going to go over all of the legendary weapons that you could be picking on your account when it comes to the Godforge's mini quest mini game. Because obviously, as you guys know, you can take one weapon, one legendary hero, and one imprint all into your starting account when you boot it up for the first time on the good old, obviously, open access, early access that should be coming. We hopefully around March time. We don't know until we get the confirmation date, but we're all excited for it. But the one thing is, these weapons are quite important for your account because, as many people tell you, there is different ways to be picking a weapon. For specifically people who want to have a safe, chosen weapon that they know if they pick this weapon, it's going to take them pretty much from the early game to mid game to the late game and kind of get a lot of value out of it compared to maybe certain players that do want to go for weapons for specific play styles or team compositions that they're going to try and build as early as possible with maybe a lot of spending in summoning. Who knows? But this video is going to try and give you as much as a fair assessment like I did with the heroes when it comes to just these legendary weapons. And just to use it, we are using the Godsend, the one and only Raven Pyrus' gaming website, which does showcase the level 1 of these weapons. But if you guys want to know more, guess what? You can check out my Pantheon's Discord down below, Camp Half-Blood. Big shout out to Zombie and as well Mr. Mo doing all of the Godsend work and basically having this weapons and imprint section that you can literally find all of the information, which I'm going to be using today from level 1 all the way to the max level percentages, so you know exactly what you're in for. So smash that comment and subscribe. Let's get into the fun of it, right? Let's talk about these good old weapons, what you're going to be picking, because like I said, there is a distinction on what you want to go for a weapon. They could be players that want to go for specific weapon play styles. This means, for example, if you're picking Dracula and you're going Lady Shock, well, you do want to go for a weapon that really does synergize with that start to really give you the best chances available to that team. Otherwise, there's different ways where, like me, you kind of want a weapon that might be really good no matter what the situation, which is kind of like the jack of all trades, master of none, but you know is going to be by your side for the beginning. And this is the way we're going to have, obviously, these ratings set up, where my S tier will be the best picks for myself that I'll be aiming for. A tier are also considerably going to be good picks. You know, these picks are going to be anything that if you pick an A tier weapon, no one is honestly going to frown upon it. They're just going to be like, you know what, good luck. It'll be really interesting to see how that journey starts. B tier, I honestly think is going to be weapons that I would rather get summoned or even obtained through events and obviously crafting them through the forging mechanic. And then C tier is going to be where I honestly draw a mini line and call it weapons that are potential gambles for specific hero starts. And that is it, because I don't think there's any such thing as a D tier weapon at all, especially in the legendary category. They're all really good in their own rights. So the very first weapon is Aegis, right? This is basically Athena's shield, as many people know, and as you can see here, it has a 15% chance to reflect the disable back to the enemy. And what's really cool is no matter what, the very first disable always reflex. So you get 100% on the first one, then any subsequent obviously disables later on in that fight is going to be at the 15% chance. With the info from obviously Camp Half-Blood, this does scale up to 33% chance, right? So when you got to think about this weapon, you got to think obviously the types of content that you're going to be in, especially from early game, mid game to late game. And Aegis feels like one of these weapons when it comes to the tier list that I can't put in the S tier, because the thing is, if it was an S tier weapon, that means it's gonna be so good that you know it's gonna basically carry you even with a weak team. The thing is, what I see the Aegis is actually a B tier weapon where it's actually pretty good for your team, but you'd rather try and find this in the game. You'd rather try and obviously build this shield in your team, because yes, it is actually a really cool utility effect, which might be really powerful in the right bosses and the right dungeons that you're going to be needing to clear. Because one thing that I've always noticed, which many content creators keep forgetting about, especially with Godforge, is the best teams in Godforge Alpha 3, especially the ones that went from 140 all the way to the 150 and stopped players from playing a game, were actually these type of compositions that had a Mordred in, a Skadian, an Odin, Percival, basically some sort of disruption to disable and actually stop people from doing things, because damage can only get you so far, and that is like a really key thing I think Simon and kind of like the Fateless team are trying to push when it comes to the Godforge content, right? So because of that, I'm following that same philosophy, and I do think it's going to be really powerful to have Athena's shield in the game, but you're going to want to craft it. You're not want to start with it compared to some of the other weapons that I am going to get into, right? Kind of similar on the next weapon here. You can see the next one right at the top, and if you don't know what it is, this is the Ame-no-Nuboko. This is a legendary accuracy weapon, it says here, but basically it's Izanagi's weapon, and that is the honest to goddamn truth. This weapon gains 1 stack and it maxes out to a 7 stack when it's maxed out, and you get either Temporal Aegis 2 or Arcane Aegis 2 when your turn meter or divinity is reduced by an enemy. So really powerful, honestly to God, weapon for turn meter based teams and divinity based teams that are all trying to constantly reduce the enemies, right? This is all what kind of Izanagi's kit does as well, just to give you guys a little heads up on that. And I think, again, similar to Aegis, I actually think this is a very powerful weapon when it comes to where we could put this in the tier list, right? However, I think this is in the C tier, which is one of these weapons that I think is super powerful later on when you get the right team. But right now in the early game, maybe if you pick Izanagi for your starting hero, you're gonna want this weapon to really make it go crazy, right? However, if you're not picking Izanagi and you're not going down that team path, I honestly feel like this is a complete gamble. And the only reason I think this is a complete gamble, which I think many people will agree with, is we actually don't know what Temporal Aegis or Arcane Aegis actually means. We don't know what these stacks are. We don't know what these buffs are. And that's only because in Alpha Wave 3, we never had them, right? And because of that, we can't comment on this actual buff. So with that, you can try it if you want, but I'll tell you now, that is literally like rolling the dice on the roulette wheel and trying to guess it right. So for me, I'm going to put it in the C tier, where it's just a complete gamble, and I just wouldn't really go for this at all. It's probably one of the lower tiered weapons for my first pick choices. Now we got Aten, right? So Aten increases the damaging effect of debuffs. So if you are playing a Blaze team, a Bleed team, an Acid team, right, this is actually going to increase the damage on it, and it's pretty good. At max level, though, it's when it gets kind of scary, because it is 70% increased damage. So this is a really interesting weapon to rate. Why? Because as many people will tell you, in Alpha Wave 3, we tested blood teams and we did test acid-based teams, and we didn't get fully ended on with the Blaze teams, but we did get some good testing. What we found out, and this was only alpha, and this is why it's really interesting, damage over time based teams basically have a max cap, and that is the best way of putting it. We figured out if you ran this team, no matter what, by this amount of turns, you will basically have hit your maximum potential of damage. And if you want to go over that damage, you need to start thinking of ways of doing more damage between turns, like these guys are doing, but on a way bigger scale, right? So, because of that, me as a player, I actually don't want Aten at all, right? However, I can see out the legendary weapons if you are picking a Blaze starting hero like Ra, right? Or you're picking, I'm trying to think, you can't pick YDG because he's internal. So it's basically Ra, right? If you're picking Ra, this might be the only time you're picking this weapon, but apart from that, very similar to maybe it's actually a B tier, actually. I'll put it B tier, where if you get this weapon later on, especially for your bleed-based teams and your blaze-based teams and so on, it's actually going to be a really good core part of that team. However, you could still probably find better A and S tier weapons instead of this slot that you could put in your team and still run these bleed and blaze and whatever you pick for your team composition. But this A weapon or this S weapon would have actually just served you a lot better, a lot longer, and been a lot more of a carry, if you want to consider that, in the game. This kind of falls on the same principle as Bloodsword, unfortunately. So this is inflicts 15% increased damage to targets under bleed, and Bloodsword, just like Aten, is that thing. This is that one weapon, if you are playing Dracula, you want to kind of pick this up, right? This is Dracula's weapon. It's going to stack the 15% damage from Bloodsword on that passive, which is 10% on Dracula 2, and then his ultimate, which is 80% increased damage for all of the stacks of bleed that you remove on him. That's a lot of damage increase, right? So you're going to think, if you are playing that play style, this weapon is going to be applicable to you. So that means if you're going Dracula, Lady Shock, no one's going to hate you if you pick this weapon, because they'll understand why you've picked it. And again, I think it'd be quite interesting to see players who did go down this route compared to the other weapons that I'm actually going to put up there. But for me, this is in the C tier, just like the Ame-no-Nuboko, right? However, I will say that I actually would consider the Bloodsword better than this weapon. Why? It's just a lot more newer player friendly, and I think a lot of newer players and beginners wouldn't mind just making a really cool bleed team with Dracula, Lady Shock, and looking for the other Virage faction-based bleeders and whacking them all together into this really crazy concoction and doing some massive bleed damage over turns, right? I can see it. I can actually see it, right? But I wouldn't recommend it, though, for the majority of players. So that's why it's in the C tier, and that's why it's still better, I think, than the Ame-no-Nuboko. So now we're getting on to the real heavy hitter. This is the very first heavy hitter I think anyone knows about, right? Excalibur. Increase the damage inflicted by allies for 3% for each buff placed by this hero. So this is super important, if you've not guessed it, to any sort of invoker in the entire game. Because the thing is with Excalibur, when you max this out, it goes up to 5.5% maximum according to the current information that we've got. And just remember, all this information that I'm giving you in today's video can subject to change on the early access, as the teams have already said themselves, right? You've got to think 5.5% for each buff. Even if you just put one buff on every single person, that's 5.5% extra damage everyone's doing. It adds up. As soon as you start looking at any of the heroes that can be like Apollo, that can put a mend on someone and at the same time put some sort of like attack up buff or a defense up buff. People can put accuracy buffs up. People can put sharpen up, right? There is a lot of invokers that are at the top of the game, and many of you guys have probably been picking yourselves. And if you've picked any invoker, and even if you didn't pick an invoker, Excalibur is still that good of a weapon, because you got to think, if you find anyone like an Isolde, Isolde provides an insane amount of buffs to a team. Honestly, she provides mend, defense up, and attack up all in one. And I think she does something else. I could be mistaken, right? Because I know she does the turn meter as well. That could all have changed. But that's just a rare hero, and that's 3 buffs from one hero. That's giving you what? A 16.5% extra damage increase. And that's for your entire team. So if you've not guessed it, this is one of the S tier weapons in the game, right? You need to have Excalibur in your life, because the thing is, what's so good about Excalibur, you've got to think this weapon is equipped to your invoker, and no matter what the content is, if you're playing dungeons, if you're playing campaign, if you're playing PvP, if you're playing whatever you want to, your heart desires, your team always needs an invoker, and that invoker's job, or whoever's job it is in that team, is always to provide buffs. Provide as many buffs as possible. And whenever they provide the buffs, they buff your team up even more. And that's so powerful. This is S tier up there for me, right? Next weapon. Another absolute powerhouse in my eyes. Forgefire. Reduce the damage received by 10%, and does not receive damage per wave until this hero takes their first turn. That's kind of what this Forgefire says here. When we read the actual one, you reduce damage from 10 to 28% per wave until this hero takes their first turn. So if you speed tune your tank correctly, your tank would have a 28% damage reduction on them. And that is pretty darn good. And people might not underestimate this, but you got to think the further you get into content, the higher it scales up. The higher that content scales up, the more reduction value you actually get out of your Forgefire. Argument's sake, you go against level 110 bosses, right? You take 1,000 damage. Well, 28% is 280, right? So you take out 280. But when we get into the later stages and they're doing 10,000 to 100,000 to 1,000,000 damage, and they're doing, and you're reducing that by 280k, it starts to kind of add up, right? And why this is so good, because it is good early, it's good mid-game, it's good late game. And the thing is with the Forgefire, obviously if you pick the Forgefire, it's one of these weapons that's designed for your tanks. So if you're one of those players in the game that's, instead of not picking an invoker, but maybe you've picked like, an Athena, maybe you've picked I don't know, Fujin, Heimdall, right? You could just get Forgefire and pick it and whack them on it. Even if you didn't pick a defender, just to make argument's sake on why Forgefire is also good, you're going to probably find Tristan super early on in the game, which is a defender. He can use this and he's going to absolutely laugh, especially when you find people like Brynhild as well that can just tank for days, and now you're reducing her damage that she takes by 28%. Forgefire is one of these weapons that I actually think is very powerful in the right circumstances. However, do I think it's an S tier weapon? Because that is a very tall order. Because this is kind of like the jack of all trades tank weapon. No matter what you play, if you're playing a tank, you kind of want this weapon. Like, especially compared to a lot of these other weapons, right? These are very situational compared to how versatile and flexible these two weapons are. So I think I am going to put it in that S tier for that reason. Because if you're a tank player and you want to play defenders, you're going to want this weapon. And even if you don't find an Excalibur, but you find a Forgefire, making sure your guy doesn't, die is going to be a massive value train the longer you start playing this game, in my eyes, right? So we'll put it in S tier. We'll see how this plays out. Moving on to the next one, though. We've got the Maquahuitl. I can't pronounce this one. The Mac slap, as I like to call it. The Mac slap. So this is one weapon I actually do really like this. So you reduce the enemy's HP, attack, and defense by 5%. And this stacks up to 1 times, right? So this is attacking enemy, so attacks. And what's really important is the way this is kind of read, because normally you can kind of see how things are phrased, but because this is just saying attacks, in my eyes, if you're running Sizin's attacks are all AoE, and if you're AoE stacking 5% reductions on HP, attack, and defense stats, and this stacks all the way up to 7 times, which is 40%, right? 40%. No, 35%. What am I doing? 35%. 35% of stat reductions on your HP, attack, and defense. That's kind of disgusting. And you got to think, how good can you get this off? Well, we've already seen how powerful and how easy it already is to obtain heroes that can join attacks. And if you start joining attacks as well as doing attacks in your own turn, this is going to stack up quite well, especially even against waves, against bosses, against technically players in theory, right? If you're hitting the right guys with the weapon. So I actually really like this weapon, and I don't think many people like this weapon as much as I make it out to be. And maybe I am wrong about this, but the thing is, to me, this feels like the most versatile weapon, honestly, in the game, because all 3 stats matter, and you can whack it on anyone. And it's instant value. And if you have area of effect, it's even more value, right? And you can really play around who has this weapon on them. And you can have this in any situation. And again, reducing bosses' attack and defense by that amount of stats is going to be huge later on when you're going to need to reduce those stats. So then you've got damage reduction as well on top of your team, and that's making you actually survive these fights instead of relying on Phoenix or relying on Immortal. So because of that, I'm actually going to put it, and this is going to shock a lot of people, but in the S tier. I love this weapon, and it's going to shock a lot of people, it will, but that's where I am honestly thinking. It is one of these weapons that I think is just this stat remover. And if you're a stat remover, you can, increase stats, or you can make it so stats don't matter, aka damage reduction, like the Forgefire. In my eyes, these are all good picks. I don't think anyone, when they start using these weapons, are going to feel left out, right? Obviously, if we look talking in terms of power, I actually think this is in the right order. I do think Excalibur is stronger than Forgefire, and I do think Forgefire is possibly stronger than the Maquahuitl, but this is going to be super close. This could be like this. That's how close I actually think these 2 weapons are, and we wouldn't know until we properly test getting these joint attacks in and getting these stacks in, and how powerful this actually is compared to the Forgefire. So for now, let's just leave it like that. Top 3 quite easily, because we're moving on to the next weapon. This is the Mjolnir. Every 3rd hit attack inflicts 50% increased damage, and this is one of those weapons where I'm just going to slap it straight away where it belongs, and it's in the A tier. It's a good weapon. It's nothing crazy compared to the other 3, in my opinion. However, it is designed for those heroes that are multi-hitters, right? So even though you might be playing maybe a Perun is not a good example, but you can understand where I'm going with it. Perun attacks 7 times, right? And there's a lot of heroes that can attack 4 times, even Sun Wukong. Sun Wukong does double AoEs and he attacks 8 times, right? You gotta think, when there's multi-attacking based heroes and their kits allow them to attack multiple times, especially single target attacks, stuff like this is actually a really fun weapon, and it just lets you do inherently just more damage because it's just exactly what you're doing already. It's extending the extra damage that you've already, you know, should have been putting out. So it's not one of those weapons that's going to be like absolutely game changing. I think that's going to be like, you know, Excalibur level where you feel the 10.5, you know, 10.11%, I don't know what it is, right? 5.5% max each stack on them, you know, on your allies, all this stat reduction, all this damage reduction, but it's not a bad weapon at all, right? Similar to the next weapon, and this is one of the hardest weapons I think many people have, which is buffs placed on this hero are instantly removed, and this grants 5% divinity, turn meter, and grants a permanent damage increase of 5%, right? This Namsaru is one of these weapons that I've been cooking and looking for a long time, and it is a very insane weapon when you start to understand what it's all about, right? This grants, at maximum, by the way, 11% divinity turn meter for your team. So anytime they lose a buff or a buff gets placed on them and this strips it, they go up 11%, 11%, 11%. So over time, they can overtake enemies. And when this starts getting out of hand is when you start looking at different imprints and even team compositions where you can start to make use of this, right? You gotta think, if you're using something like an Isis or even a Pandora, and you've got Namsaru basically on your main damage dealer, let's just argument's sake, like an epic hero, Gilgamesh, or Beowulf, which is a lot of people's kind of go-tos, which they can relate to, or even like Musashi, for example, right? Any of these guys, right? You put Namsaru on them, you gotta think, anytime Isis goes to mend them, or goes to obviously steal these buffs and put it onto a team and spread it, it doesn't spread on Namsaru. It increases their damage and it makes them take their turn faster. And when you get the imprint like Mokosh's imprint says whenever one of these effects, like a buff, gets removed on this hero, well, you heal a part of your maximum HP. So with Mokosh's imprint and Namsaru, this makes you have an insane combo that allows that individual to actually heal from the removal of buffs while getting permanent damage, while getting the turn meter and divinity. The thing is with Namsaru, as many people will say, is we don't know the actual true potential of this weapon, meaning we don't understand how far we can really stack that permanent damage increase. Because the thing is, Namsaru is this one legendary weapon which might hold the key to getting the infinitely insane high damage numbers that people really want to do in like clan bosses and in the big boss dungeons again for these certain records or maybe in certain events. And it's because it's one of these weapons that I think many people look at confused because it's a high skill ceiling weapon. It makes you need to understand what the game is about and understand how to exploit the game to really get the power out of it, right? Because of that, I want to put it in one of these tiers, but I think it's such a hard weapon to really understand unless you are someone that's building purposely around this weapon. And because of that, I put it in the C tier. But it is the king of C tiers because it is the one weapon that if you really do some research and look at some imprints, look at some starting legendary heroes from Godforge quests that you want to go down the route for, and just think, okay, if I get this hero, I get this starting hero like Guan Yu, and I put the Nam on Guan Yu with my imprint of choice, how is this going to work? Is this going to start absolutely decimating? If it does, it's going to be an absolute monstrous one. But I think it's one of these weapons, like I said, it takes a lot of understanding and research to make it work, and it's not what I would recommend majority of you guys to do. But when you have this, Oh boy, I can't wait to find this in game, because when I find it in game, I'm honestly going to be testing so much stuff. It's kind of crazy, right? Moving on to the next one, which is a really good weapon, Solar Flare. So Solar Flare is gaining 20 divinity when joining an attack. So it's a very simple one. You put on anyone that you want them to constantly ultimate, and in teams that you can imagine with stuff like Shamash, right? So if you've got like Shamash, if you've got Vivian is another good one, right? Basically anyone that can force join attacks, Solar Flare is going to be what you kind of need as your bread and butter. Why? We've already tested it in alpha, and it was a really powerful weapon, being able to get this divinity kind of going through. It wasn't obviously as powerful as you can kind of see here on our little sheet that I've got. I think if we've got it, it increases to, I think it's like 30. I've forgotten what it is. But Solar Flare, it's a very interesting weapon. Is it one of those weapons that I would say is an S tier weapon though that many people should go for? No. I think it's an A tier weapon though. I do think it's one of these weapons that's maybe almost S tier, and maybe some content creators would say this is an S tier weapon because of the joint attack mechanics. And again, some of those joint attack mechanics are insane. However, again, if I can get joint attacks and just instantly stack these buffs on them, for example, right, and make it so they just don't do anything, I'd rather have that over, I think, the Solar Flare, which does go up to 44 divinity on attacks, right? Which does help you get to your ultimate. It does help get to your ultimate, and that's why it's such a good weapon. But I think there is better choices, again, in these three that you could be starting off with, and it will just make your, again, starting journey in Godforge a lot more easier. And more importantly, it will be with you from the beginning of the game all the way to the end. And that's kind of what you want, this early game investment that you can keep throughout, not just kind of here and there, right? This is kind of the same with Thunderbolt. When this hero joins an attack, you increase their turn meter by 5. Really powerful weapon, this Thunderbolt, right? As you can see here, this is giving you 11 divinity whenever the joint attacks. And again, if you put this on, for example, let's just put it on a Guan Yu starting hero, and you do have Shamash. And so let's just say you were super lucky and you had a bunch of summons because you spent some money and stuff, and you got Aphrodite. Well, Shamash Aphrodite with this Thunderbolt is going to make that guy go crazy. The amount of turn meter and divinity that you're going to be getting over from all the joint attacks is going to be absolutely bonkers. It's going to be super fun, and it is going to be really enjoyable to play with. But compared to, again, these other three weapons, I just don't think it's going to stack up. I do think, though, again, it's better than Mjolnir, because these joint attack weapons that both give divinity, and this one's giving you divinity and turn meter, but specifically to that hero, right, are very powerful tools, which are very good weapons. But this is, again, not the overall power weapon list. This is kind of a starting journey on what I would want to be looking out for and what I'm picking for certain reasons, right? So coming up to the last kind of two here, we've got Tlachinolli, which has increased damage to enemies under Blaze. So this is, as you can guess it, coming into the same realm as Aten. The difference is Aten makes sure, obviously, bleeds do like 70% more damage, while this, or Blaze, for example, or while this says if they're under Blaze, your natural damage, so your skills, is doing 15% more. And you can guess, again, if you've not wanting to build this, it's not going to be too applicable to you, right? This weapon, even though it's a 33% increased damage under Blaze, if I remember correctly, there's no Blaze starting hero, right? And the only way to get Blaze early on is finding an Icarus, unless they find some other heroes that we've not seen yet, as well as maybe a Bastet. And that's kind of where your Blaze team's going to be rolling, right? You're going to have like a Ra with like an Icarus Bastet setup with maybe some sort of Emotep and who knows, maybe just like a Tristane, right? Just a really like good overall tank that can just shield. And that's what you run. The issue is though, like, would you rather have 33% increased damage on Ra when he's doing damage to those guys under Blaze, right? Which is a fair one. Or would you rather just have like Excalibur, which is giving you not 6%, but gives you 5.5% extra damage for each buff, right? Because if I put 3 buffs on Ra, he's basically got that same number almost, right? He's getting there with just 3 buffs, and we can add a lot more buffs in this game, right? A lot more buffs. And because of that, it kind of just puts this weapon in this weird camp. I don't even want to put it in this B camp. Do you know what? It kind of is. No, it's not. It's this weird camp because the weird. Do you know what? I actually take it back from the beginning of the video. I actually put it in the D because I would honestly rather have Aten on my bleed or my Blaze-based teams, right? Because my bleed's doing 70% increased damage on max HP, right? Compared to my single hero doing 33% more damage under a condition. And that's what's putting me off. The fact that it's a singular buff on under a condition, and it's not even going to be like one that I feel like I'm going to feel. So I'll be honest, I'm not on that wagon. Tlachinolli is a D tier for me, unfortunately. I didn't think I was going to make one, but it's there. Sadly, but surely, it's down there. And then we come to the end, which is Worldsplitter. So each time this hero lands a strong hit, you increase their strong hit damage by 10%, and you reduce their incoming damage by 5%, and this stacks up. So if you come back into here with the full one, you can see this is stacking up to 7 times. So obviously, as you've guessed it, this is very similar to, I'm going to call it, the other A's and B's, right? If you're building a strong hit team, this is going to be a core weapon in that team. Like anyone will tell you, that will be the core weapon of that team. However, we need to see how powerful these strong hit builds are, right? Some strong hit builds in Alpha Wave 3, because I ran Icarus, which is a strong hit build too, with an insane amount of crit, that does an absurd amount of damage for a rare hero, right? So much that the dev saw those numbers and tuned his kit down in Alpha Wave 2 and 3, right? So if we can do stuff like that with a rare hero, imagine what you can do with an epic and a legendary, especially when it's tweaked correctly and you build towards it, and that's your whole mana jammer. But as we kind of said in the earlier video, and as we've talked about a lot of these, you know, weapons, it's a play style, and because it's a play style, and because it's something that you kind of need for these particular play styles, and it's gonna be strong, I actually am gonna put it in the A category. I actually think it's going to be better than these, and the reason I'm thinking the Worldsplitter is better than Aten, why I think it's actually better than even Aegis, is because again, Aegis is going to be situational for bosses, it's going to be situational for those type of encounters where it's going to really matter, but you can find things that are alternatives in the game. Aten is this, again, really specific weapon, but it's better because it covers bleed, acid, and basically any debuffs that deal damage, right, Blaze. And because it covers all the damaging debuffs and it increases their damage, it's not too bad. And especially when you play bleed comps, it's a really good bleed comp weapon when you start to have max stacks and it's doing 70% more on top. Like, it kind of adds up, right? Same with these C's. These C's are really good. And to be honest, I would say Nama is better than most of these A weapons and B weapons. That's how powerful this weapon is. If this is a power list, this would be up here, right? But because it's not a power list and it's actually about picking the best kind of weapons that are going to fit the starting lineups and get people going, I think these are my top 3 picks. And if you've guessed why, it's because they're just versatile. I need a versatile weapon in this game. If I pick something that's really, you know, tailored to one situation, and it's not going to help me in different situations as I'm acquiring brand new weapons and brand new heroes to change up my team compositions, and I'm going against different bosses, that's when we're going to start falling short, because you're going to start finding areas where, yes, Blaze and Bleed and Acid are going to be great, but then you're going to find areas where they're just absolutely terrible. And because of that, you'd rather have just had a weapon that might have been able to circumvent that difference in power with your team, with either damage reduction, stat reduction on the enemies that you're fighting, or damage increase on yours, right? So these are my top picks. Hope that makes sense to you guys. And as you can see, we do have all of the epic weapons. So if you guys want to see all the weapons in an overall power tier list, which is legendary weapons and epic weapons, and I compare actually how powerful I think these weapons are and not which ones are the best ones to pick on your first starting journey, let me know obviously in the comment section down below. But until then, smash like, comment and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's video. Obviously a lot shorter than the other 2 tier lists because there's obviously less content to do in this one. So until the next one, stay safe, stay sneaky guys, peace out.